There are promises that feel like miracles. The kind that arrive just when life has pushed you to your knees. The kind that make you believe God has finally answered your prayers. But no one ever tells you that the most dangerous promises don't come wrapped in threats. They come wrapped in kindness. They arrive with warm smiles, reassuring voices, carefully prepared contracts, and people who look you straight in the eyes and say, "Trust me." Because betrayal rarely begins the day someone breaks their word. It begins the day you believe they never will. I learned that lesson when I was 25 years old. Back then, I believed love meant sacrifice. I believed family was worth any price. And when a woman from one of South Korea's most powerful families promised that one decision could save the people I loved, I didn't hesitate. I signed my name with trembling hands, never realizing I had just signed away everything that made me who I was. My home, my future, my dignity, and a part of my heart that I would spend the next 7 years searching for. My name is Mia Nankunda. This is the story of the promise that was supposed to save my family, but turned me into the sacrifice. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to know which country you're joining us from. If you enjoy emotional Afro-Korean romance stories filled with unforgettable twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. The rain had a way of finding every crack in our roof, and that morning it found 3 new ones. I woke to the sound of water dripping into the metal basin my mother had placed by my bed, each drop landing like a small clock ticking away another day we couldn't afford. Outside, the village of Nakaaseek was waking up slowly, cockerels crowing over the hum of morning prayers drifting from the chapel down the road. I lay still for a moment, listening to my brother Isaac's breathing in the next room. Shallow. Too shallow for a boy of 17. I had learned to listen for that sound the way other people listened for danger. By the time I reached the clinic that morning, my uniform was soaked through, but I didn't mind. The women were already waiting outside, some with swollen bellies, some with babies wrapped tightly against their chests. I had delivered half of those babies myself, in this same clinic with its cracked walls and its generator that failed more often than it worked. "Nurse Mia," old Mama Grace called out, waving me over with her toothless smile. "My daughter is asking for you. She says the baby is coming today." I smiled back, though exhaustion sat heavy behind my eyes. "Then let's go meet him." 3 hours later, I held a healthy baby boy in my arms while his mother wept with relief. This was the part of my work that reminded me why I had chosen it. The moment fear turned into joy. The moment a woman who had nothing still received everything. I dreamed, someday, of building a real clinic. Clean walls, working equipment, a place where no mother would ever have to bury a child because we lacked what other hospitals took for granted. But dreams, I was learning, required money I didn't have. When I returned home that evening, my mother sat at the kitchen table with papers spread before her, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. She didn't look up when I entered. "Mama?" "It's nothing," she said quickly, sliding the papers beneath a cloth. But I had already seen enough. Land deeds. Our land deeds. "You're selling the back plot," I said. It wasn't a question. Her shoulders sagged. "Isaac's specialist in Kampala says his heart is getting weaker. If we don't send him abroad for surgery soon." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I sat beside her, taking her tired hands in mine. "We'll find another way, Mama. I promise you." But that night, lying awake, I wondered if promises like that meant anything at all when your pockets were empty and your prayers seemed to bounce off a silent sky. The call came 4 days later. I was cleaning instruments when my Uncle Moses appeared at the clinic door, out of breath, his eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in years. Hope. "Mia," he said, "I need you to listen to me. All of me, before you say no." He told me about an agency, one that worked with international families who needed help starting their own. A surrogacy program, he called it. Wealthy clients, full medical care, and compensation large enough. His voice dropped as he said the number. Large enough to send Isaac abroad twice over. Large enough to build my clinic with money left to spare. I laughed, though nothing about it was funny. Uncle, that's not real life. That's not how things work for people like us. It's real, he insisted, pulling a folder from his bag. I spoke to the coordinator myself. It's a legitimate agency, registered, connected to a family in South Korea, the Hong family. They've done this before, quietly, for women who needed a chance. I pushed the folder back toward him. Carry a stranger's child for money? Uncle, do you understand what you're asking me? His face softened, and for a moment I saw the man who had raised me after my father died, who had walked me to school every morning holding my hand like I was made of glass. I understand that Isaac doesn't have another year to give us, Mia. I understand that your mother is selling the only land your father left behind. I am not asking you to throw away your life. I am asking you to save your families. That night, I could not sleep. I walked outside beneath a sky heavy with stars, and sat on the cracked step, where my father used to smoke his pipe, and tell me God answers prayers in strange ways. Sometimes God answers prayers through doors that frighten us, Uncle Moses told me the next morning, as if he had read my very thoughts. I prayed for 2 weeks straight. I fasted. I asked the pastor for guidance, and he only said, "The Lord opens doors we don't always understand. He also gives us wisdom to walk through them carefully." In the end, it wasn't fear that made me sign the contract. It was love. Love for a brother whose heart was failing. Love for a mother who hadn't slept a full night in months. Love for a dream that refused to die quietly, no matter how many times life tried to bury it. Seoul did not feel real the first time I saw it. Glass towers stretched so high they disappeared into the clouds, and the streets moved with a rhythm I had never known. Fast, polished, purposeful. Everything about the Hong Fertility and Family Foundation felt the same way. Clean marble floors, soft classical music playing from hidden speakers, staff who greeted me with practiced smiles and gentle bows. Dr. Yoon, the physician overseeing my case, explained every procedure with patience I hadn't expected. "You are safe here, Miss Nankunda," she told me during our first meeting. "Whatever you need, we will provide." But it was the woman who arrived on my third day who left the deepest impression. Chairwoman Hong Ji-hoon moved like someone who had spent decades commanding rooms without needing to raise her voice. Elegant in a way that seemed effortless, dressed in soft gray silk, her presence filled the office before she even spoke. She studied me for a long moment, and I braced myself for judgment. Instead, she smiled. "You have kind eyes," she said simply, taking the seat across from me. "That is rare in this world." We spoke for nearly an hour. She asked about my mother, my brother, my dream of building a clinic. She listened the way few powerful people ever bother to listen to someone like me, fully, without distraction, as if my answers actually mattered. Before she left, she reached across the table and placed her hand gently over mine. "When this is over," she said, her voice steady with conviction, "your family will never struggle again. I promise you that, Mia." For the first time since Isaac's diagnosis, I let myself believe the future was finally turning toward me, instead of away. I did not know then that promises, even sincere ones, could be twisted by hands the person making them never saw. It happened on a night I wasn't meant to witness anything at all. I had gone downstairs to the foundation's private kitchen for warm milk, a small comfort Dr. Yoon recommended for sleepless nights. The corridor was dim, most offices dark except for a thin line of light beneath a door near the east wing. Voices drifted through it, low and tense. I recognized one as belonging to Han Do-yoon, the foundation's chief legal advisor, soft-spoken, precise, a man who always seemed to choose his words as carefully as a surgeon chooses an incision point. I should have kept walking. Instead, something in his tone made me pause. "Cannot allow this to surface," he was saying, his voice tight with a control that felt rehearsed rather than natural. "Do you understand what happens if it does?" A second voice, unfamiliar, murmured something I couldn't make out. Then Han Do-yoon spoke again, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. Ji Hune must never discover that embryo survived. I froze in the hallway, my cup of warm milk trembling slightly in my hand. I didn't know who Ji Hune was. I didn't understand what embryo he meant, or why the words were spoken with such quiet desperation, as if the wrong ears hearing them could unravel something enormous. All I knew was that the warmth I had felt in Chairwoman Hong's office, the fragile hope I had carried since signing that contract, suddenly felt thinner than before, like a blanket that had never quite covered the whole bed. I told myself it was none of my business. I told myself I was here for one reason only, to save my family, and then to go home. I had no way of knowing that the sentence I'd just overheard was the first thread of a lie that would take 7 years, an ocean, and a broken heart to finally unravel. I only knew that when I finally returned to my room that night, sleep did not come easily. And somewhere beneath my ribs, a small, quiet voice, one I would later wish I had listened to sooner, whispered that not every promise wrapped in kindness was safe to hold. The weeks that followed my sleepless night settled into something almost like peace. I told myself the conversation I'd overheard meant nothing. Foundations like this one surely carried 100 secrets that had nothing to do with me. Old grudges, boardroom politics, the private business of a family I would never truly belong to. My job was simple: carry the pregnancy, stay healthy, go home to Isaac and my mother with enough money to change everything. So I focused on what I could control. I became close with 2 of the nurses, Ha-eun and Soo-jin, who took turns teaching me small phrases of Korean between my appointments. Ha-eun laughed at my accent without cruelty, the way old friends laugh, and Soo-jin brought me tteokbokki from a street vendor near the clinic, because she said I looked too thin for someone carrying a baby. "You worry too much," Soo-jin told me one afternoon, watching me stare too long at my monitor readings. "Dr. Yoon says everything is progressing beautifully." "I know," I said. "I just want to understand everything. Every test, every form. I don't want to sign my name to something I don't fully know." She smiled, but something flickered behind her eyes before she looked away. "Sometimes it's easier not to ask too many questions here." I laughed it off at the time. Now I wonder if she was trying to warn me. Small things began to trouble me as the months passed. A blood test I remembered clearly taking would vanish from my file, only to reappear days later with a different date stamped on it. An appointment with Dr. Yoon would be rescheduled without anyone telling me why. Once, I asked to see a copy of my own medical chart, and the request took 11 days to be approved. 11 days. For paperwork that should have taken an hour. Security around the residential wing tightened without explanation. New keycards. New guards who didn't recognize me even after months of seeing my face every day. I mentioned it to Ha-eun, who only shrugged and said the foundation was being cautious, though she wouldn't say cautious of what. I told myself it was simply how wealthy families operated. Careful, private, perhaps even paranoid. I had no reason yet to believe the caution had anything to do with me. There was one evening, though, that I couldn't quite explain away. I had gone looking for Soo-jin near the records office, hoping to ask her about a cramping pain I didn't want to mention to Dr. Yoon just yet, and I found the door slightly ajar. Inside, a man I didn't recognize was photographing pages from a thick folder, his movements quick and practiced, the way someone works when they don't want to be caught working at all. He noticed me before I could step back. "Wrong floor," he said simply, in accented English, and closed the door before I could respond. I told Ha-eun about it the next morning. She went very still, then forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Probably an auditor," she said. "The foundation does internal reviews sometimes." But when I pressed her for details, she changed the subject so quickly, I understood the conversation was over whether I wanted it to be or not. I let it go. What else could I do? I was a guest in a country I didn't fully understand, dependent on people whose language I was only beginning to learn, carrying a child that wasn't mine to question the terms of. So I swallowed my unease the way I had swallowed so much already, and I told myself that whatever secrets moved through this building, they had nothing to do with me. I was wrong, of course. I simply didn't know it yet. I met him for the first time in the Foundation's private garden, a space I wasn't technically permitted to enter but had slipped into anyway, craving fresh air and sunlight that didn't come filtered through glass. He was sitting on a stone bench, sketching something in a leather notebook, dressed simply enough that I mistook him for one of the garden staff until he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not looking up. His Korean was clipped, formal, the voice of someone used to being obeyed without needing to raise his tone. "I didn't realize gardens required permission," I answered, more sharply than I intended. That made him look up. His eyes were sharper than I expected, assessing me the way you might assess an intruder rather than a guest. "This section is reserved for family." "Then I suppose I'm trespassing," I said, and turned to leave, embarrassment burning in my chest. "Wait." He stood, closing his notebook. "You're one of the surrogacy participants." The word landed strangely, clinical, in a way that stung more than it should have. "I have a name," I said. "Mia." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite an apology, but close to one. "Ji Hune," he said. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," I interrupted, though it wasn't. I walked away before he could say anything else, my heart hammering with an irritation I couldn't fully explain. Later, Ha-eun would tell me who he was, the youngest grandson of the Hong family, an architect who kept his distance from the company his relatives ran, a man rumored to have loved and lost someone the family never approved of. "He doesn't talk to anyone," she said, almost admiringly. "You're lucky he spoke to you at all, even to scold you." I didn't feel lucky. I felt like a stranger who had wandered into a house full of people, speaking a language of grief and power I would never fully understand, no matter how many months I spent within its walls. I didn't think of him again for weeks. I had no reason to. I didn't know his full name carried the weight of an empire, or that the word family he'd used to keep me out of that garden might have applied to the child growing inside me more than he could possibly have imagined. Labor came on a rainy Tuesday, nearly 3 weeks earlier than expected. I remember the fear more clearly than the pain, the sudden sharp certainty that something was different, followed by Dr. Yoon's calm voice instructing the nurses in rapid Korean I couldn't fully follow. I remember Soo-jin holding my hand and telling me to breathe, her own voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. And then, after hours that blurred into something timeless, I heard him cry. That first cry, sharp, furious, alive. I asked to hold him. I remember asking twice, my voice cracking with exhaustion, and a longing I hadn't expected to feel so violently. The contract had prepared me for this moment, told me plainly that I would not raise this child, that my role ended at birth. I had accepted that condition with clear eyes months ago. But nothing had prepared me for how it would feel to hear him cry and not be allowed to comfort him. "It's better this way," Dr. Yoon said gently, though her eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. "For both of you." They took him from the room before the nurses had even finished cleaning me. I lay there, empty in a way that had nothing to do with childbirth, and told myself this was the agreement. This was what I had signed. I had known this moment was coming since the very first meeting in that marble office. I told myself I would survive it. I had no idea how much more there was still to survive. 2 days later, while I was still recovering, immigration officers arrived at the foundation without warning. I remember the confusion first, the sudden presence of uniformed men in a building that had always felt so carefully controlled, so insulated from the outside world. Then confusion turned into disbelief as one of the officers began speaking, his words translated hurriedly by a Foundation staff member I didn't recognize. Visa violations, document fraud, discrepancies in my entry paperwork that I had never seen before, and certainly never signed. "This is a mistake," I said, over and over, my voice rising with panic I couldn't control. "I have a contract." Chairwoman Hong herself. I tried calling Ha-eun's phone from the hallway, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. It rang once and disconnected. I tried Soo-jin next, and the call didn't connect at all, as though the number no longer existed. I remember staring at the screen, willing it to ring back, willing someone, anyone, from the world I had trusted for the last 9 months to answer and tell me this was all some terrible misunderstanding that would be resolved by morning. No one answered. "Chairwoman Hong is not available," the staff member said flatly, refusing to meet my eyes. My passport was taken from my hands before I could argue further. I was moved through procedures I didn't understand, signed documents in a language I couldn't fully read, was told repeatedly that resisting would only make things worse for me. Ha-eun and Soo-jin were nowhere to be found. Dr. Yoon did not come to see me. The kindness that had surrounded me for months evaporated so completely, it felt as though it had never existed at all. Within 48 hours, I was on a plane back to Uganda. No explanation, no chance to hold my son one final time, or even to learn his name. I sat by the window as the plane climbed above Seoul's glittering skyline, tears sliding silently down my face, and I told myself the compensation would still come. It had to. Chairwoman Hong had promised it herself, had looked me in the eyes and meant it. I was certain she had meant it. I made myself a single promise amid the wreckage of every other one that had been broken. I would survive this. Somehow, I would survive this. I had no way of knowing that somewhere in that glass tower behind me, a decision was already being made about money that was supposed to reach my family. A decision no one would explain to me, made by hands I would not learn the name of for 7 long years. 7 years is long enough to convince yourself a wound has healed, even when it hasn't. I returned to Nakaaseek a different woman than the one who had left it. Thinner in some ways, harder in others, carrying a grief I didn't have words for, and couldn't explain to anyone who asked why the daughter who'd gone abroad for an opportunity had come home looking like she'd buried someone. In a way, I had. My mother never pressed me for details. She simply wrapped her arms around me at the airport gate and held on until my knees stopped shaking, and later, when I finally told her a version of the truth, that the arrangement had fallen apart, that there would be no money, that I had left something of myself behind in that country, she didn't ask me to explain further. She simply nodded, the way people nod when they've learned that some pain is better carried quietly than picked apart. Isaac survived, in the end, though not because of anything I brought home from Seoul. A church group from Kampala heard his story through a pastor's network and raised enough for a partial surgery, and a visiting cardiac team from Nairobi covered the rest as part of a charitable mission. He is 24 now, working as a mechanic, strong enough most days that you would never guess how close we came to losing him. I thank God for that mercy often. It is one of the few unbroken promises I have left to hold on to. I never built my clinic. Instead, I returned to the same rural health center where I'd trained, now senior enough to oversee 2 junior nurses, still delivering babies in a building with cracked walls and an unreliable generator, still borrowing equipment from Kampala when a mother needed more than we could give her. The dream hadn't died completely. It had simply shrunk down to something I could carry quietly, a small ember I fed in private moments rather than a fire I spoke of out loud. I did not speak of Seoul, not to friends, not to the pastor, not even to Uncle Moses, whose visits grew shorter and more infrequent with each passing year, though I never understood why until much later. When people asked what had happened with the Korean family, I told them the arrangement had fallen through due to medical complications. It was not entirely a lie. It simply wasn't the whole truth. Uncle Moses had changed too, though I didn't let myself examine it closely at the time. He'd paid off his debts within a year of my return. Quietly, without explanation, buying back a small parcel of land he'd once sold to a neighbor, and starting a modest poultry business that, by all appearances, thrived faster than anyone expected. When I asked him about it once, half joking, he laughed it off. "God has been merciful to this family," he said, and something in his voice made me drop the subject rather than push further. I told myself it was simply relief after years of struggle. I did not let myself wonder where mercy like that actually came from. Looking back now, I understand the guilt I mistook for grief in his eyes every time we sat across from each other at Sunday dinner. At the time, I only knew something between us had shifted, some quiet distance that hadn't existed before Seoul, and I chalked it up to the general strangeness of a family trying to move past a wound none of us spoke about directly. Some nights, I still heard him crying. That first cry, sharp and furious and alive, the only sound of my son I would ever know. I didn't know his name. I didn't know if he had my eyes or Ji Hune's stubborn jaw, whether he was gentle or fierce, whether anyone sang to him at night the way my mother used to sing to me. I had built an entire imagined life for a child I would likely never meet, and some part of me understood how foolish that was, and grieved anyway. In Seoul, life had folded itself back into its usual rhythms, as life in wealthy places so often does. Chairwoman Hong believed, with complete sincerity, that the surrogacy had concluded exactly as planned, that Mia Nankunda had received her compensation, returned home, and quietly resumed her life with gratitude for the arrangement. She had, after all, personally authorized the payment. There was no reason for her to doubt a process she trusted completely. Hong Ji-hoon, for his part, had long since buried the memory of the strange, sharp-tongued surrogate he'd startled in his grandmother's garden. His life had moved forward in the way lives do. More buildings designed, more distance kept from the family business, more quiet evenings spent in a home that still, 7 years later, felt too large for one person. He still believed the embryos he and his late fiancée had created together had been destroyed with the rest of the fertility clinic's discontinued records, a fact that had once nearly broken him and that he had, with great effort, learned to live beside rather than beneath. The Hong family, broadly, believed the surrogacy program had ended without incident. It was a footnote in a much larger empire. One chapter among thousands the family's various foundations had quietly closed over the decades. Han Do-yoon, meanwhile, had risen even further within the Hong group's inner circle, trusted now with matters far beyond the fertility foundation that had once been his quiet domain. He sat on committees. He advised on succession structures. He had become, in every visible way, the man Chairwoman Hong relied on most to protect the family's future. Whatever he knew about the night I overheard in that dim corridor 7 years earlier, he carried it the way men like him carry everything, silently and without a trace. He rarely thought of Mia Nankunda anymore. If he thought of her at all, it was only in passing, the way a man might recall a door he once closed and never checked again. He had no way of knowing that a journalist's quiet curiosity and a grieving man's grief would soon force that door back open. The unraveling began, as these things often do, with someone who had no idea what they were about to uncover. Yuna Park was an investigative journalist with a small but persistent following, known for digging into Korea's fertility and surrogacy industry, after a series of anonymous tips suggested irregularities in several elite programs. Her research led her, eventually, to the Hong Fertility and Family Foundation, not because she suspected anything about Mia specifically, but because financial records from that period showed unusual patterns that didn't match standard compensation procedures. Around the same time, in a decision that had nothing to do with Yuna Park's investigation and everything to do with his own restless grief, Ji Hune began quietly reviewing his late fiancée's medical files, a ritual he performed every year around the anniversary of her death. This time, buried in an archived folder he had never been given access to before, one released only after a routine digital migration exposed records that should have remained sealed, he found a single line that changed everything. 1 embryo, successfully implanted. He read it 3 times before he could accept what it meant. His search that followed was quiet, methodical, and utterly consuming. Clinic logs, foundation transfer records, a discreet conversation with a retired physician who, out of guilt more than loyalty, finally admitted what she had long suspected but never dared to say aloud. Piece by piece, the truth assembled itself in front of him, until finally, a single name appeared at the center of it all. Mia Nankunda, Uganda. He didn't tell his grandmother anything about what he'd found. He didn't tell a single soul, not even colleagues who had known him for years. He simply booked a flight the following morning, telling himself the entire way to the airport that he was going purely for answers, not for anything resembling hope. He was not looking for love. He was only looking for truth about a child he had been told, for 7 years, did not exist. I was restocking supplies when he walked into the health center, and for a moment, I didn't recognize him at all. Older, more weathered around the eyes, dressed simply enough that he could have passed for any foreign aid worker passing through. Then he said my name. Mia. The voice did it. Something in me went cold and hot all at once, memory crashing over me before I could brace for it. The garden, the marble floors, the cry I still heard some nights in my sleep. "You need to leave," I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to keep it steady. "Please," he said, "I only need a few minutes. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because—" "I know exactly who you are," I said, cutting him off, my hands trembling as I set down the supplies I'd been carrying. "Hong. I saw the name on your passport application 7 years ago, before your family destroyed my life and disappeared without a single explanation. Mia, please." I didn't let him finish. I walked to the door of the health center and held it open, my whole body rigid with a fury I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. "Whatever you came here for," I said, "I don't have it. Not anymore. Your family took everything I had to give a long time ago." He left without another word, though something in his expression told me this would not be the last I saw of him. I didn't sleep that night. I sat outside on the same cracked step where I had once prayed over a contract that had promised to save my family, and I wondered, for the first time in years, what exactly he had come looking for, and what it would mean for the fragile peace I had built if he found it. Isaac found me there near dawn, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders without asking why I was awake. He had always known when not to push. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said quietly, settling beside me on the step. "Something like that," I admitted. He didn't press further, only sat with me in silence until the sky began to lighten, the way he used to when we were children, and I would wake from nightmares I refused to describe. I was grateful, in that moment, for a brother who had learned patience the hard way, through years of hospitals and uncertainty, and who understood that some fears needed company more than explanation. Half a world away, Yuna Park sat at her desk long after midnight, staring at a spreadsheet of banking records she had finally, after months of quiet requests and denied access, managed to obtain through a whistleblower inside the Foundation's finance division. Wire transfer authorization. Full compensation amount, matching exactly the sum promised. Signed and dated exactly as the Hong Foundation's official records claimed. But beneath the authorized transfer, a second document, one that should never have existed in the same file, one the whistleblower had flagged specifically because it didn't match anything else in the archive. A witness signature on the altered routing form. Yuna zoomed in closer, certain she had misread it. She hadn't. The name staring back at her, clear and unmistakable beneath the forged authorization, belonged to a man she had never once heard of, from a country she had never had reason to investigate before that particular week. Moses Nankunda. Uncle Moses came to the health center 3 days later, without calling first, his hands trembling in a way I had never seen before. I knew, the moment I saw his face, that something had finally broken open. "Mia," he said, his voice cracking on my name. "I need to tell you something, and I am asking you now, before you hear it any other way, to remember that I loved you before I made the worst mistake of my life." I set down the chart I was holding, my stomach already tightening with dread. "Uncle, what is it?" He told me everything, standing in the doorway of the health center, as though he didn't deserve to come further inside. A man named Han Do-yoon had approached him quietly, less than a week after I left for Seoul, offering him a sum of money larger than anything he had imagined possible, in exchange for a simple signature on what he was told were routine banking verification documents. His role, supposedly, was only to confirm my identity remotely for the Foundation's records, a formality for a surrogate living abroad without immediate family present. He told me it was standard procedure, Moses said, his eyes wet with a grief I didn't yet know how to name. He told me the money would only be released faster if the paperwork moved smoothly. I didn't know, Mia. I swear before God, I didn't know what I was signing until it was already done. You knew enough to take money for it, I said quietly, and watched him flinch as though I'd struck him. I knew I was desperate, he admitted. I knew he offered me more than I'd ever be able to earn honestly in 10 years. And I told myself signing a form wasn't the same as doing something wrong. I told myself it was a small thing. I didn't know it would cost you everything. I stood there for a long moment, feeling something enormous shift beneath the foundation of every memory I had of him. The man who had raised me, who had walked me to school holding my hand like I was made of glass, who had told me God opens doors we don't always understand. You didn't just sign a form, Uncle, I said finally. You helped them erase me. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, tears finally spilling down his weathered face, and said the only thing that mattered in that moment. I am so sorry, Mia. I have been sorry every single day for 7 years. I didn't forgive him that day, but I didn't turn him away either. Some betrayals, I was learning, come wrapped not in cruelty but in desperation. And desperation, however forgivable in theory, still leaves the same wreckage behind. That night, I sat with my mother on the same cracked step where I'd once prayed over a contract I didn't fully understand, and I told her everything Moses had confessed. She listened without interrupting, her weathered hands folded in her lap, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long time before speaking. Your uncle made a terrible choice, she said finally, but he did not make the choices that stole your money, or your years, or your peace. Those belong to other hands entirely. Do not let your anger at him blind you to who truly deserves it. I turned her words over for days afterward, unsure whether I agreed, unsure whether forgiveness was even something I owed anyone yet. But I understood, at least, that grief has room enough to hold more than one kind of anger at once. Ji Hune returned 2 days after Moses's confession, this time with a folder of documents instead of empty hands, and a journalist's phone number he'd gotten through channels I still didn't fully understand. I know you don't owe me anything, he said, standing at a careful distance this time, having clearly learned from our last encounter. But I need you to look at this, please. I took the folder with hands that weren't quite steady, and as I read through page after page, banking records, altered routing forms, a witness signature that matched my uncle's handwriting exactly as he'd already confessed, something in me finally cracked open completely. The compensation was paid, I said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces. It was always paid, someone just made sure it never reached me. Han Do-yun, Ji Hune said, my family's chief legal officer. He's spent years positioning himself as the most trusted man in our organization. And the entire time, he's been rewriting our future from the inside. He paused, something raw crossing his face. He also hid something from my own family. An embryo we believed was destroyed. A child born from it, 7 years ago. I went very still. The one you were talking about that night. In the corridor. You heard that? Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, then a kind of quiet reckoning. Then you've carried this question longer than I have. I never asked what it meant, I said. It wasn't my business. He was never mine to wonder about. Ji Hune studied me for a long moment, as though the sentence cost him something to hear. He's being raised by a family outside Busan. Safe, loved, as far as I can tell. I only learned the truth 3 weeks ago myself. Then, let him stay where he is, I said, and I meant it, even as something in my chest pulled tight around the words. I didn't carry him to keep him, Ji Hune. I carried him because I made a promise, and I kept it. What your family owes me isn't him. It's the truth, and what you stole from me, after I gave you everything I agreed to give. He nodded slowly, and I watched him understand, maybe for the first time, what he had actually walked into. Not a woman searching for a lost child, but a woman demanding to be seen for what she had already sacrificed. Then that's what will get you, he said. The truth, and everything that was supposed to be yours. The unraveling of Han Do-yoon's conspiracy happened faster than any of us expected. Once the pieces finally came together, Yuna Park's investigation, combined with the documents Ji Hune had already gathered, gave the Hong family's internal counsel more than enough evidence to launch a formal inquiry. Chairwoman Hong, when she was finally shown the altered banking records and the forged witness signature, sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute before speaking. 7 years, she said quietly, to no one in particular. I trusted him with everything, and he used that trust to rob a woman of what she was owed, and to hide the truth from my own grandson besides. Han Do-yoon did not go quietly. He tried at first to claim the discrepancies were clerical errors, then attempted to shift blame toward lower-level staff who had long since left the foundation. But the evidence was too thorough, too carefully documented by Yuna's months of investigation, to be explained away. Bank transfer logs showed his authorization codes at every altered step. Immigration records revealed he had personally requested the fraudulent visa violation report that led to my deportation. And beneath it all sat a motive that made painful, calculated sense once everyone understood it. A surviving embryo, discovered and acknowledged, threatened the entire succession structure Han Do-yoon had spent over a decade quietly positioning himself to control. And a surrogate who asked too many questions, paid in full and satisfied, was a far smaller liability than one left angry and unpaid with nothing left to lose. He was removed from the Hong group within the month, facing both civil and criminal charges that would take years to fully resolve. I did not feel triumphant when I heard the news. I felt only exhausted, the way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you'd carried so long you'd forgotten what your arms felt like empty. Chairwoman Hong personally oversaw my public apology, not because the scandal demanded it, but because she insisted on it herself. My trust in the wrong man allowed this to happen, she said, in a statement that made no attempt to soften her own responsibility. Mia Nankunda kept every promise she made to this family. We did not keep ours. Her name, her dignity, and her years of stolen peace deserved to be restored publicly, not quietly. My name was cleared. The stolen compensation, along with a formal settlement, was finally paid, this time with no hands reaching in to redirect it. I built my clinic, in the end. Not in Seoul, and not through anyone else's fortune, but on the same land my mother had once nearly sold to save Isaac's life, using funds that were finally, truly mine. We named it the Nankunda Maternal Health Center, and on opening day, mothers from 3 surrounding villages stood beneath its bright new sign, waiting to walk through doors that would never turn anyone away for lack of money. Ji Hune stayed in touch, at first out of guilt, and later out of something steadier. He never asked me to be part of Minjun's life, and I never asked to be. Some evenings I wondered about him anyway, whether he had my mother's laugh, whether anyone sang to him at night, and I let myself wonder without reaching, the way you let yourself think of a door you chose, with clear eyes, never to open. Months later, Ji Hune arrived at my clinic with no entourage, no business proposal, and no expectations. Just a single suitcase and a question spoken so quietly I almost missed it. Would you let me help build what's next? I looked at him for a long moment, remembering the woman who had once signed a contract with trembling hands, believing sacrifice was simply the price of love. That woman had learned, through more heartbreak than anyone should have to carry, that the most dangerous promises are the ones wrapped in kindness, and that keeping your word, even when it costs you everything, is never the same as being foolish for it. Yes, I said, finally softly, let's build it together. If there is one thing I would want you to carry from my story, it is this. I was never someone's lost mother waiting to be found. I was a woman who kept a promise, and I spent 7 years demanding that the people who broke theirs finally answer for it. That is the whole of what I fought for, not to reclaim what was never mine, but to reclaim what always was. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what part of Mia's journey touched you most. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable Afro-Korean romance stories. filled with betrayal, truth, and the promise that healing is always still possible.